Hey, what is going on, folks? My name is Hellbent and welcome to this first tutorial in a series of showing you how to create games using AutoHotkey. In this first one we're going to be working with something very simple. That's just adding a generic player to our game and then using the arrow keys to move that player around, defining what the boundaries that it can move are, and perhaps adding in some health to our player and being able to add or subtract damage. So I've already created a new script. Now this is a question that I get asked all the time throughout all my tutorials is what editor I'm using. So I'll just say that I'm using an editor called Site for AutoHotkey. You can find it by doing a Google search. Other than that, I can't tell you anything about it. I do know that on the AutoHotkey forums, if I remember correctly, there is a subcategory that tells you a bunch of different editors that you can get. So this might not be the editor you want. This one is very simple. It does what I need it to do, so I like this one, but there's a bunch of other ones as well. Okay, so like I said, I've created a new script somewhere on my computer, and now I'm just going to come in and edit it. You should have at least a little bit of experience creating scripts before you jump into actually doing these kind of things with scripts. So, I expect that you know how to create a new script. I'm just going to do single instance force. So that way when I close the script, or when I try to rerun the script while testing it, it'll automatically close any previous instance. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an emergency exit, and I'm going to set my emergency exit so that way if I press escape, it's going to exit app. Or control plus escape, it'll exit out of the script. Okay, we're going to be, in this one, like I said, we're just going to be working with actually moving the player, just using the arrow keys. We're not going to worry about physics in this tutorial. We're not going to be worrying about doing animation sequences, etc., etc. Actually, one of the early tutorials, so probably not the next tutorial, maybe not the one after that, but we'll go over how to do how to add in images and animate it, so that way you can have like a walk cycle, a run cycle, a jump cycle, etc. So here's a little example of that. So I'll have my little guy come up here on the screen. So let me make sure that stays up here. So I'm going to get Mega Man to come and jump across the screen, and later on I'll show you how to do that, like how to program different sequences for walking, running, jumping, etc., adding the physics into it, gravity, etc., shooting weapons, blah blah blah, all kinds of things. There's millions and billions of different kinds of games you can create. You don't necessarily want to only be doing games like that, so we'll cover a lot of other things like programming logic, etc. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to create a simple game space for our player to sit in. So I'm just going to create a GUI, and I'm going to set it to always on top. And this way, even if I'm typing, I can keep it up on the screen, so that way I can make edits as I'm typing. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the background color so it pops a little bit better. So I'm going to change GUI color to black. And the last thing I'll do now before we continue is I'll just show it. GUI show, and I'm going to set its position, the window position, so it sits over here on my screen. My resolution is probably going to be different than yours, so you're going to probably have to, if you want to do the same thing, you're going to have to play around with the X and Y location. I'm going to set mine to X 800, Y 100, and I'm going to give it a width of 500 pixels and a height of 500 pixels. And I'll just give it a generic name, the game. Next, I'll leave the auto execute area of my script by adding in a return, and then after the return I'm going to make it so that way when I hit the X at the top corner of the window, it actually exits the script and not just close the GUI, leaving the script open in the background. So I'm going to do GUI close, which is a hidden label basically, and I'm going to, or a label attached to a hidden button that's not typed out in my code here, and when I press that, all I want that happen is I want to exit the script. we have enough to run a test now, and we should just get a black window that's sitting over there. And there we go. So there's our game. This is where our player is going to be. Now we need to add a player. Like I said, we're not going to be worrying too much about this or that. We're just going to go right for the guts of it, adding a player in quickly and moving it around. So rather than using an image or blah blah blah, I'm going to use a progress bar. So I'm going to add a progress bar. And now I need to add in its options. And for its options, because we're going to be changing the position of our player, like our player is going to be, their X position is going to be changing, their Y position is going to be changing, I'm going to use variables for that. But not only that, because all these variables, the X position of it, the Y position of it, because they're all part of a set, like it's all part of my player, right? I'm going to actually create an object that's going to hold all that information. And if you're not familiar with objects, you can think of an object as basically just a variable that holds other variables within it. So I'm going to create a larger variable called player, and I'm going to make that an object, and inside that object I'm going to create the smaller little variables that are part of that player object. So for example, I'm going to have X to represent where its X position is. Now the names that I give these, they can be whatever I want them to be. So even though I'm using X to represent X position, it could literally be anything I want. So I can call it Bob if I want it to. Bob could represent the X position, right? So I can give it any name that I want. I'm just going to do X for the X position, and I'm going to set it so that way it sits somewhat close to the center of the screen. X200, and then a comma, and now the next key or the next variable that's inside of this set is going to be the Y position, and I'm going to set its value to also 200, comma, and now I'm going to do W for the width of that object. I'm going to give it a width of, let's go with 100, comma, and height, and I'm going to set the height to, let's go with 20 pixels. Okay, so there we go. I have a player object now, and to use this object inside of my control, what I need to do is force an expression. So to do that, I'm going to start by typing out a % and then giving a space, and all the stuff that's literal text, which is most of the stuff that you would normally put in it, I have to put inside of quotes. So for example, the option for X, I'm going to put inside of quotes X. And then beside that, I'm going to say player. I'm going to reference that player object and say player X. So it's basically saying the X position is the value that's in player.x, which is 200. So rather than typing X200, I've typed a variable to represent it. Next, I'm going to do Y. So I need to open and close quotes. This time what I need to do is I need to make sure I add a space before I put Y, because other words, what's going to end up happening is, if you can imagine, let's say X10, normally you'd have something like X10 space Y10. If I was to do that, it would probably give me an error. So to get that space right there, what I need to do is in the quotes, I need to literally have that space that separates these different values. So remember that if you have an error, if you have a problem, this could be one of the things that are giving you a problem if you type this out. Okay, besides that, I'll reference player.y, and next we'll do width. Once again, last time I'm going to say it, I added a space before the W. Player.w. And height. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, because I'm using a progress bar usually has two different colors, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those colors in, and once again, because I'm literally using text, what I need to do is put it in quotes, and I'm going to do C for color, and this is the main color, and I'm going to use lime, a nice bright color. And beside that, I'm going to do background, the background color, which is normally going to be the trim around it. I'm going to do red. So C with no space lime, background with no space red. Now I'm going to add a variable that I'm going to associate with this control so I can reference it later to update the movement and blah blah blah. So I'm going to say V, and I'm going to call this player1, player_1. And I think we have enough there. The next thing I'm going to do is, because we're using a progress bar, I'm going to use health. I'm going to add a health to our character. So in our player object, I'm going to add one more thing in here, or another key in here, key value pair, and I'm going to say call it health. And I'm going to set its value to 100 to begin with, and then in the parameter here, the last parameter here, I'm going to reference that player.health. So now when I run this again, what we should get is a progress bar in the center with a main, it's mostly going to be lime green with a border of red. And there we go. But we can't move it, we can't do anything like that. So what we need to do now is we need to create a game loop that's going to periodically, it's going to loop over some code to do some updates in that. And to do that, we're going to use a timer. So I'm going to, in my auto execute area, after I've added everything else, I'm going to add a timer. So set timer, comma, I'm going to attach this to a label. I'm going to call the label, in this case, move player is fine. And I'm going to set it to 10 milliseconds. Now, depending on the operating system you have, you're not actually going to get 10 milliseconds. It's actually going to be like 15.5 milliseconds or 13.5 milliseconds or something like that. But for me, when I read over my code and if I see a 10 in here, what I mean is run it at basically the fastest it'll go without doing other stuff to it. So basically I'm saying loop over this as fast as it can go. Now I'm going to create that label or that subroutine, and I'll add in a return right away. We're not going to worry about too much about optimization or anything like that. We're just going to get the code out there in a simple to easy to way to understand way. So let's just do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that way when I press the arrow keys, it's going to detect that, and then it's going to either subtract from the position or add to the position, etc., etc. And what I'm going to do is I'm also going to make it so that way if I hold multiple of the arrow keys at once, I can actually move on diagonals. So I'm just going to check each. I'm going to have 4 individual checks. So I'm going to check to see if I'm pressing up, okay. Am I pressing right, okay. If I'm pressing down, okay, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to say if, inside of parentheses, I'm going to say get key state. And then open and close parentheses, and then inside of that double quotes, and then inside of the quotes up, the word up. So if I'm pressing the up key, what I want to do is check to see if I'm still inside of the bounds of my game. So the way that the position works is the top of the screen is where Y is 0, and then as you go further down, Y gets bigger and bigger and bigger all the way till it gets to 500, which is what we've set the height to be. So Y equals 0, Y equals 100, Y equals 200, down to 500. X is 0 here on the left hand side, and as we move to the right it gets bigger. So because I'm going to be pressing the up key, I want my guy to move up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that my player hasn't gone outside of 0 or less than 0. Like I don't want it to be at -1, -10, -36, etc. So I'm going to say inside of if I'm pressing up, I'm going to check to see if player.y is greater than 0. So if I'm greater than 0, I can go ahead and do something. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take that value that's in player.y and I'm going to subtract 1 from it. You know what? Let's not hard code a speed here. Instead, what we're going to do is we'll use a variable for the player's speed, and we'll actually put this into the player object. So in the player object, I'm going to add one more key, key value pair, and I'm going to call this speed. Speed, and the speed, let's go with 1. We can move 1 pixel per frame. So in here, if I can move my player up, I'm going to subtract the speed from the player's Y if I'm moving up. So player Y minus equals player.speed. So if I can move up, subtract 1 from my position. I'm going to be adding more code later on, so I'm going to leave a little space. And now we'll go on to the next one. So if get key state, open and close parentheses, open and close quotes, down. If I'm pressing down, do a test to see if my player is still within the game. If player.y is less than the height of the game board, which is 500 pixels, so if my player is greater than 500, now how it works with my player is the Y represents the top of my player, and the width represents, the Y represents the top, the X represents the left hand side. So what I need to do to see if my player is still actually in the game is I need to subtract the height from my 500. So I can go to 500, but if I actually move my player down to 500, it's going to be outside of the screen. So what I really mean is move to 500 minus the height of my player. So that way this edge, if this edge here hits the bottom, I want to stop. So I take that 500 and I'm going to subtract the player.h, or player height. So in this case, because our height is 20, what I'm actually saying, this just basically says, is Y less than 480? If it is, go ahead and take the value that's in player.y and add the player speed. Player.speed. Okay, that's that. Let's go through left and right. If get key state, open and close quotes, left. If I'm pressing the left arrow key, do a test to see if my player hasn't moved too far over this way. So if player.x is greater than 0, so as long as I'm greater than 0, go ahead and subtract from my player.x. Minus equals player.speed. And then if I hit right, if get key state right, then do a check to see if my player is inside the bounds. This time what I'm going to be doing is, if my player is less than the width of the game board, 500, minus the width of the player. And if it is, go ahead and subtract, or add, in this case, add to player.x. So player.x plus equals players.speed. Okay, so right now if I run this, everything's going to work exactly as I want it to. It's going to update those variables, but now what we need to actually do is have it so that way we actually move the player, the visual of the player, to that new location. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type out GUI control. The subcommand is move, And which control am I going to be moving? The control I'm going to be moving is player 1, which is what we called this guy right here. We called him player 1. And where are we going to be moving him? We're going to be moving him to the new X and Y location. Now, for optimization, what we could do is each time we change these values, so like right after I update this, what I could also do is perhaps store it into a temporary variable, and then each time it comes through the loop, it can check to see if the new value, or just before it does the move, it can check to see is the value of X the same as it was the last time it ran through this loop. And if it's changed, then I do the movement, because right now even if I don't press up, down, left, or right, it's automatically going to redraw the player. It's not actually going to be moving anywhere, but it's going to redraw it. So if I want to optimize it a little bit, what I can do is have it so that way only if the X and Y, one of the either the X or the Y has new values, then do the new position. But don't worry about it. There's issues that can come out of that because you can be changing the frame rate from frame to frame by doing that way. So sometimes it might be actually better just to have it go through the way we're doing it here. But whatever. Okay, so what are we going to be? We're going to be moving it to, in quotes, X player dot X Y player.y. Okay, there we go. So now when we run this program, if we use our arrow keys, if I press left, the guy should move left. If I press up, it moves up, right, down, and if I do diagonal, it'll move on diagonals. Okay, so that's that. Now comes the first problem. What if our player speed wasn't 1? What if our player speed was something like, let's say 45? What's going to happen is, because let's say my player, on the last move I moved, let's say it positioned the Y to, let's say, 3. So I was at Y3. When it comes into this loop again, it's going to say, is Y greater than 0? Yes, it is. So go ahead and move me my player speed. In this case, player speed is 45, so I'd end up moving into negative numbers, right? So if I move my guy, he ends up out of the screen, and that's not what we want. So what we need to do in here is we're going to offset it if we actually end up outside of the screen like it is there. So we're going to do another little test inside of each of these get key state. So we're going to say if player.y is less than 0. So if I've moved out of the screen, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, right now it says player y is -3. I'm going to say nope, player y does not equal 3, it equals 0. So if player y is anything lower than 0, I'm going to say no, it doesn't, it actually equals 0. And we'll come and do that for the rest of them. So if player.y is greater than 500 minus player.height, then it does not equal that. What I actually want it to equal is player.y equals 500 minus player dot height. So if the player's y is greater than 480, just set it to 480. So if it was 483, I actually want it to just be 480. So set it to 480. If player dot x is less than 0, player.x equals 0. if player.x is greater than 500 minus player.width, then player.x equals 500 minus player.width. Okay, so now we have it set so that way we won't get out of the screen anymore. So if I press up, it's not going to go outside of 0 anymore. As soon as it registers that it's lower than 0, it's just going to set it to 0. There we go. So now, no matter where I move, and to further that example, what we can actually do is we can set the player speed to a number that's greater than the game size. So each time I move the player, it's going to move by 4,445 pixels, which is larger than the 500 pixels, but we'll see that it never actually leaves outside of the game board. It always stays in the game space. Okay, so that's that. Let's change this back to a more reasonable number. And the last thing we're going to do is we're going to detect whether we hit the side. So in this simple example, what we're going to do is we're going to say if we end up hitting the edge, we can picture that we have obstacles or whatever. And in the next video that I do, I might actually do something with obstacles. If we hit the edge, what we're going to do is we're going to subtract from our health. So inside of each of these get key states again, is we're going to do another test, and we're going to say, in the first one, we're going to say if the player y equals 0. Now the way I can do this is because it's only actually going to do this code when I'm pressing up. So even though my character might actually be at 0, as long as I'm not pressing, like, it might actually be at 0, but as long as I'm not continuously pressing up, it's not actually going to register any of this code. So it's only while I'm continuing to press up that it's going to subtract from my health. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a variable in here that we're going to call damage. So this is the amount of damage that's inflicted on me each time I touch the border. And I'm going to set it to 3. So each frame that it runs through the game loop, if I'm pressing up, each time it comes into this, it's going to subtract 3 from my health. So I'm going to say if the player y equals 0 while I'm pressing up, player.y equals 0, take the player health, player.health, minus the damage. Minus equals damage. Or subtract damage from the player's health. So first time it was 100, now it equals 97, and then 94, and then so on and so forth. So that's for that one. Here, if player.y equals 500 minus player.height, player.health, minus equals damage. Okay, that one. If player.x equals 0, player.health minus equals damage. And let's say if I have different things that do different amounts of damages, I could say this is damage 1, for example. So damage 1 has its own. Damage 1 has a value of 3, damage 2 has a value of 22, etc., etc., right? And I can change depending on what it does, what's changing off of my damage, I can change that. But let's get rid of that. So damage equals 3. Okay, last one. If player.x equals 500 minus player.width, player health dot health minus equals damage. Okay, so now if I run this, it is going to keep track of that variable that's keeping track of the health, but we need a way of displaying it. So we'll start off with displaying it in a tooltip. So after we moved it in the same loop, right after that we'll put in a tooltip that's just going to display our health. Okay, and here we can see our health is at 100, but if we hit the edge as we hold up, it's going to subtract from our health. But right now you can see that we can go into negative numbers, so we'll fix that in a second. But before we do that, let's actually make it so that way we can see a visual representation by actually affecting our progress bar. So after our tooltip, we will do GUI control. For the subcommand, we're going to leave it blank, and then which thing are we going to be affecting, which is the player 1 variable, or the player 1 control. And what are we going to be doing? We're going to be updating the value of player health into it. Player.health. So it was 100. If we take any damage, it'll change our progress bar to become more red. And as we blah 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 blah. Okay, but like I said, we have a problem where we can go into negative numbers. So what we'll do is the focus of this tutorial isn't on the end game cycles, creating new lives, etc., etc. So we're just going to do something very simple for this example, which has very little practical application. So what we'll do is in here we'll check, but this shows how you set up the logic to actually check to see if the player is dead or not, and then what you actually do if the player is dead is depending on what you want to happen. So if player health is less than or equal to 0. If player health is less than or equal to 0, what we're going to do is we are going to reload the script, and for some reason by putting reload inside of here, it causes issues where it just actually opens up another instance of the window. So what I'm going to do, as soon as it reloads and creates a new window, what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit this current window. So basically it's going to be start running the program again. If we die, it runs the program again. So our health is 0. If we hit the edges, our health gets subtracted, and then if we die, it restarts. Okay, and that's it for this one. On the next one, we're going to be looking at instead of using the arrow, I think on the next tutorial I'll do, instead of using the arrow to move your player, we're going to do it so that way you use your mouse to move the player. And maybe we'll come up with like a little game kind of like this would actually work out to be. So let's say if you have to use your mouse to move your player through a maze or something like that, and then if you hit the edges, it's going to do damage to you. So we'll create a little game, but the focus of it will be using your cursor to actually move your player. Okay, that is it for this. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one.